Hi, I'm Lenina Rassool, your host on Mental Health Matters, where every week we sit down with a mental health professional to discuss all things mental health and more. And today we are speaking about trauma, the nervous system, and emotional regulation. Now, we often speak about emotions and mental health as a sort of abstract thing. It's not like a physical ailment, like a broken arm or a fractured leg, that we can show what is wrong. And so it's difficult for us to be able to understand what is happening in our bodies because we can't see it. But research is emerging that is showing our nervous system is just as important as our body. And to understand what we're feeling, we have to look at the signals that our nervous system is sending to us. After the break, we're going to be speaking to Claudia Roodt, who is a clinical social worker and a trauma-informed therapist. And she's going to be speaking about how we can slow down, start listening to our body better, and understand what emotions is doing what to us and how we can start healing ourselves and our behavior. But before that, we're going to have a look at a short video around trauma to understand it better. Let's have a look.
Good afternoon, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about what is trauma. So there's a lot of information out there, and you often hear people say, I have been through a lot of trauma. I've been through a lot of stuff in my life. I will get through this because I have been through some or other incident. I've been through a lot of traumatic incidents in my life. But that's not accurate in terms of neuroscience, because we all go through adverse events and incidents and relationships, and not everybody is impacted in the same way. So what is trauma then? Well, we are all actually ruled by our nervous system. Why am I saying that? So you all know the slinky. Now, we are all born with a nervous system. We're all born with a stress response. But that stress response doesn't just develop. You don't just know that you need to be careful if you walk over the pavement. So our stress response comes from our relationships with our caregivers. That's why babies are born already with a nervous system and a particular stress response, because you take your cue from your mother and while you're already in the womb of the mother. That's why certain babies, when they're born, they cry and almost scream a lot of the time, and you seem to not be able to calm them down. That's not really colic. One then has to go and see what's happened to the mom and what was her stress response and stresses in her life like when she was pregnant with that child. So why am I saying this to you? So as you develop as a child, your stress response, in other words, how I am going to respond to events and things that happen to me in relationship, you learn from experience from your caregivers. So if I, for instance, have had parents who's very strict and everything I do, they yell and scream at me, then my nervous system is not going to just be like this in the day. My nervous system is going to go like this in the day, because my body and my nervous system then reacts to what is happening in the relationships around me.
Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters, and today we are speaking about trauma and especially how trauma affects the body and our nervous systems. And joining us in studio is Claudia Roodt, who is a clinical social worker and a trauma-informed therapist. Claudia, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for asking me.
So Claudia, today we're speaking about trauma, the nervous system, emotional regulation, but I wanted to get sort of an introduction to what exactly is trauma. There's a lot of talk about it, but do we really understand it? Can you give us a sort of overview?
So a lot of people will say, oh, I've experienced a lot of trauma in my life. Now, neuroscientifically, that's not correct. We all go through adversity, which is bad events. But it actually goes back to your nervous system. So we all have a stress response, but that stress response gets developed through the caregivers in your life. You actually experience the world in a wordless experience first. So touch in your nervous system. And it's almost like if I cry and I'm wet as a baby, are people going to come and put a dry nappy on? So there's an expectation in the brain, because the brain is a experience-based organ. And as your stress response sort of flares up in terms of your whole body gets ready to, I'm now wet as a baby, and you start crying, now the parent come and they put you a dry nappy on, they feed you. So now there's a build-up of experience on expectation that when I feel something that's not comfortable, someone is going to come and what we call co-regulate me or soothe me. Mm. And as that soothing continues, so the child falls and the mother comes and or the father comes or the caregiver comes and says, it's okay, I'm here. Your body learns how I fall now, it was sore, but now it's okay. Mm. So the message that goes to the brain to say the body needs to be geared up because there's danger coming, can then calm down or can stop coming, that, you know, the whole body doesn't have to be geared anymore for this danger that comes. Because the minute that we sense that danger comes, all your organs in your body becomes ready for fight, flight, or freeze. Because cortisol is released, adrenaline is released. Now, if that soothing is there, if that co-regulation is there from an adult that's calm, your body learns how to deal with adversity and stress through experience. Mm. But if you grow up in an environment where when adversity happens, no one comes to your aid, that window in the brain and in the nervous system stays open. So you stay on high alert. And all of that, almost like stored up nervous energy of the overload of cortisol all the time. Because there's no message that comes to the brain that say the incident is over, you're now safe. Mm. That kept on releasing. So you, like I always say, it's like a car's engine that runs all the time, that runs here. And now, in reality, the incident is not there anymore. Your father is not shouting at your mother anymore, or the car isn't coming in the road anymore. But because your experience is not being one of an adult that comes to my aid when that happens, your nervous system and your brain hasn't got that experience. Mm. And now in the body, there's that stored up survival energy, they call it, that needs to get stored in your viscera, in your body. And now the next time I come here to you on the show, and my body pick up something, and immediately it says, but I recognize that from before, and I go in overdrive, and I go in a mood to protect myself. Mm. Because that's what an overexposure of adversity without support does, is it puts you in protection mode. I feel I need to protect myself all the time. And that is the trauma. The trauma is that the exposure to adversity without support has left your body in protection mode. And now you respond from that. Mm. That's the trauma. If you've had support, if you've had concerning adults that come and say to you, I know this is bad, I'm here for you, the body can automatically relax. And the message that goes to the brain and the nervous system is the danger is gone. So the secretion or the flow of cortisol and adrenaline can stop. And you then develop what we call a window of tolerance. You know when you're at your peak, you know when you can calm down, you know when you... And the problem with developing trauma is your nervous system way of scanning the world becomes faulty.
So I want to ask you, I mean, this is all so fascinating for me. I'm thinking about the analogy of where someone scrapes their knee. You're a little kid and they scrape your knee. And I have a daughter, so obviously we do come. Sometimes we kiss it better or we put the plaster on. And I'm thinking none of that takes the scrape away or lessens physically. You know, we can't physically unless we give them Panado. But we sort of start forming a framework around, we're saying, okay, yes, you've got a scrape on the knee, but the scrape on the knee is not a life-threatening thing because I'm here and I build this frame of what you call the window of tolerance and of that. So that when we move on there and we start seeing the world, we can start to, I think, differentiate what is really life-threatening and what's okay and not
absolutely right.
life-threatening.
So also what you do is you help, there's three types of stress, if I can call it. There's toxic stress, there's tolerable stress, and there's positive stress. We all need positive stress in our lives. I mean, I'm sweating under my arms as I'm sitting here because I'm on the show.
Yes.
But we all need that bit of stress to perform at our best. Positive stress is the stress where there are still people that support you. Because your nervous system, your body needs to get that physical touch of the danger that's out there is gone and can't harm you anymore. Tolerable stress is a bit more than positive stress, but there's still people that can buffer you.
Yeah.
Toxic stress is when there's no one that buffers you. And children doesn't have the ability to buffer themselves against the adversity. So a child that grows up in a home where there's domestic violence, there's no one there that's going to buffer them, because the people that's supposed to buffer them is also the people that's causing the alarm that goes up. There's an immediate alarm in our bodies when you feel I'm not safe now. And if that alarm is not being buffered by adults, your body doesn't know how to buffer any stress going forward. You need to have had that experience. If you've not had that experience, and your alarm in your brain and your body will go off at the smallest thing in life that's actually not life-threatening, but to you it is. And that's the trauma.
So I want to use this example that you're giving. I mean, I like this idea of us having, the differentiating between the three types of stress. So you're saying positive stress is, it's normal for us to be nervous before we come onto a show. I deal with people who are so afraid to come onto the show. Sometimes I have to sit for 2 hours, chatting to them on the phone before the time. But I also know that public speaking is a huge fear for many people. And so when we think about, let's talk about public speaking, which is not no one's going to drop dead on the stage or be attacked, but your perception of maybe what happened earlier, let's say you were in a school play and you messed up and everybody laughed, and let's say you go home and instead of people telling you it's going to be okay, instead of people buffering that for you, they also made fun of you. I mean, sometimes on TV, I saw a TV show the other day where this boy then messed up, and if his father then just laughed at him and said, you see, you're useless. And so he develops this whole long-standing sort of threat. So when he gets on stage, he starts sweating and his heart starts beating and he starts becoming really hot and anxious and he can't speak.
That's a brilliant example, because as human beings, we learn through association. And you might say, or other people might say, but that's got nothing to do with what you're experiencing now. But that's exactly that. So, for instance, I did debating at school. And it was the one thing that my father actually took pride in. But he never attended it, and he would listen to me going through my speeches before the time. But did I dare pronounce a word wrong? He will tell me, go and read it up, or that's pathetic. But he would also say to me, I will not come and listen. And if you come and you barge to the door, I know that you've won the competition. If you come slowly, I'll know you failed, and then you don't have to come up to my room. So because I facilitate in trauma, I have this whole mind talk to myself before the time. And it's because I love the work that I do.
but there is still the small message of my dad in the back of my mind. Like, what if I facilitate and people don't get what I'm facilitating? Because Dad always said, yeah, well, then you're not a success. So everything that we do comes from our first relationships, and it starts in utero. Alan Shaw talks about the first 1,000 days of a child, but the first 1,000 days starts the day of conception, not the day the child is born. So also, what is the mother going through then, and how is the child already programmed in utero? So that when that baby is born, how do we buffer the baby so that we understand your nervous system and your brain learns from what the parent demonstrates. And so you build your skill to know, okay, so that danger is not there anymore. I can now relax in my nervous system. Otherwise, you stay dysregulated, and that's the trauma.
I read the other day, I was doing some reading on intergenerational trauma, and there was a piece that actually said, in utero, the mother's cortisol levels while she is pregnant can affect, and this is part of how sort of trauma gets passed. And I often thought about domestic violence during pregnancy and the loud noises that we know the fetus can hear and how that is related to the cortisol. And
also the mother's coping mechanisms is passed down to the baby. Peter Levine has a wonderful explanation of trauma. He says, trauma is not what happens to you. Trauma is what happens inside of you because of what's happened to you in the absence of an empathetic other person, or normally a caregiver in a child's instance. And that is why for children that's experienced adversity, even pre-birth, to try and help that children and even adults who's not got a framework of any care or any buffer before the time is very difficult. It's difficult in therapy to turn that around, because your view and your lens of how it feels to be buffered, how it feels to be soothed. Bruce Perry talks about our first experience of co-regulation is your mother's heartbeat in the womb. And you actually want to go back to that all the time. You want to feel that. That's why rhythm and rocking is so potent in terms of healing of trauma.
But okay, so before we get there, I mean, this is going so great, and I'm starting to understand a lot. I want to ask you, I want to come back to when you said, trauma, we learn about trauma from association and how these experiences for us, whether it had a buffer, and so it becomes an adversity that we can handle, versus what there's no buffer and it becomes a trauma. And so I did want to ask about different types of events that become either adversity or trauma. Now, not all trauma is equal, but they are equally valid. But what often comes up for us, especially in speaking, is that, oh, you're so sensitive. So different people have got different traumas. Some people will not understand the depth of terror that someone else would feel in front of the camera. Someone would not understand sort of smaller things. I often say, so I'm divorced, but when my divorce happened, I wasn't too worried about being divorced, but that's also because my mother had been divorced when I was very young. So I knew it wasn't a life or death situation. I knew it wasn't a life is falling apart. It was hard and it was painful, and the things that led up to the divorce were hard and painful. But I wasn't worried about everything is going to fall apart if I get divorced. And I actually said, after my mother's divorce, we moved into sort of a communal home with other aunties and mothers who were single and were providing for all the kids, and everything was fine. And that was my sort of buffer, my sort of regulation. And yet other people were very incensed and upset about the divorce, and I couldn't understand it. So I went to ask, so now you are making me think, when people react in certain ways that we think is overreacting, is oversensitive, clearly there's a root for those.
So there's always a root. There's a guy, Benjamin Fry, who wrote a book called The Invisible Lion. And he makes the analogy. He says, if there's now someone that come running in here and he's screaming wildly and he's visibly upset, we're all going to look up and think, okay, what's going on here now? And then the next minute, a lion comes running after him. And all of a sudden, we all will think, okay, well, now it makes sense. But that's exactly what happens in mental health, is we can't see the lion that's coming after people. And that's different for every person. And I'll give you a practical example. So I trained in July at a game reserve in Pretoria. And I slept in a bungalow, and because it's a game reserve, there were bats. Now, I wasn't warned before the time, and it might sound something very silly, but I woke up second night and there was a bat in my bungalow. I was petrified.
I would be too.
And I went and stood outside, and I put the lights off and I put the lights on, and this thing wouldn't disappear. So I knew that the game ranger was sleeping and his family in the bungalow next door, and I went to wake him up, and I said, please come and get this thing out. He didn't make fun of me, thankfully for that. So that was a bit of a buffer. The next day, there was a lot of sort of in between and innuendos of, yeah, you should know, you're in the wild, you're in Africa. And I'm like, no. So the owner of the place came and he said, we will immediately transfer you to another bungalow. Didn't ask, didn't say anything. And I was so grateful for that. Why I'm sharing this with you is nothing that happened in my life as a child, I was said, it's okay, Mom and Dad is here. So this was seeming very non-important to some of the people there. And they would laugh, like, you're in the wild. What are you upset about? It took me right back to when I was a child. And no one saw that I was actually scared of this thing. And that's what trauma actually does, is the registering in the brain and the nervous system, whether it's something psychological or physical that upset you, the same part in the brain registers. And I often hear people talk about big T and small t. I don't like that, because what might seem small to you might have had a very big effect on my life and what I associated with. And as you were explaining about the divorce now, it's about who was there for me initially in my life. And, we often hear parents say to the child, get up, you only fell. You're going to fall a lot later in life.
Yeah.
No, but if the child now is buffered, that falls later on in life will become easier. And it's about the community and the caring adults, because you literally develop a map in your brain of how you see relationships, how you view. The child becomes what the child is exposed to relationally.
This is so important, I think, for all of us to hear, and it also brings through the importance. And I have to say, throughout every show where we're speaking about mental health, more and more this thread comes through where we think about the importance of relationships and community and the social system and social support. Whereas, as someone who does a lot of research in this space, often we think of mental health as an individual endeavor. And we think of healing as tools and programs and whatever programs we need to go through individually. And yet, what you are bringing through is the importance of the social system as a buffer. And absolutely. I also want to say, I love that you brought in the analogy, this analogy of how it's different for everyone. I try to remember myself. I say sometimes to my daughter, I had to walk to school every day. Do you know how easy you have it, like being driven? So let's say we've moved one step up the ladder, so she gets driven to school. And I try to remember that she has zero context for what walking to school is, because it's an empty comparison. I love this conversation. We have to take a short break, but we will be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters. We are speaking about trauma, about emotional regulation, about the nervous system and what's happening in the body when trauma occurs. And still with us in studio is Claudia Roodt, who is a clinical social worker and a trauma-informed therapist. And Claudia, we've been having a fascinating conversation about trauma, really digging deep into how some of those associations begin, even in utero, about what's happening in the body when we experience trauma. And I think one of the most important things that I learned was there's a difference between adversity, which is something that we all go through, difficult things, and then how and when it becomes a trauma, and the importance of having a support system to sort of buffer you against that. So I wanted to move a little bit into sort of, now we have this knowledge. And so I'm sure a lot of us are sitting and thinking about and going, I know I am going back to like all of the things that I've experienced in my childhood, trying to weigh up whether it was an adversity, whether it was a trauma. And look, we live in a very fragmented society. So when you explain it that way, I keep thinking, wow, there must be so many of us where our adversities became trauma because there isn't a social buffer. We're thinking about single parent households where the single parent is working, where both parents are working, where, our schools are hostile environments to a degree, not enough supportive teachers. I know when I speak to a lot of people who have been through a great deal of trauma and adversity, there's often I'm thinking of one particular story about a little girl who was sexually assaulted by her uncle, and her person was a teacher. This teacher was the person she disclosed to. Her parents were not the buffer. So now we've been through a lot of trauma, I think it can be safe to say, within the context of South Africa. We now have this knowledge that you've given us, and we can acknowledge, okay, fine. We've been through a lot of trauma. We can identify these spaces where there was no buffer and there was no regulation. We can identify these things that trigger us. How do we use this knowledge now?
Okay, so the important thing is that for years in the field of trauma therapy, the earlier years, they tried to only work with the brain, the cognitive part of the brain.
That's the thinking part.
That's the
right?
thinking part.
Yeah.
But you have to include the body and the nervous system, not only in trauma therapy, but in day-to-day living.
And can I ask, the nervous system is sort of the feeling part?
Yeah.
I mean, I'm simplifying it, but...
Yeah, and the nervous system is the sensations that you experience in your body when you experience life. Because what actually happens is your body experiences things before your mind does. And your nervous system is your autonomic nervous system, which is made up of two branches, the parasympathetic, which is the shutdown, but also the more engagement part of us. That's where the polyvagal theory comes from. And then there's the sympathetic, which is fight and flight. Now, you experience things through your nervous system first before your brain decides. I can come in here, I can have a certain reaction, and afterwards think, why did I now say that to Lenina? And that's how we work. Your body actually have a reaction way before your thinking brain come and realize why this has happened. So because of that, because we are neurobiologically made like that, designed like that, we need to include the nervous system in our day-to-day running of our lives. So the first thing I always say to people when I start seeing people, when I train people is, are you aware of the signals of your body and your nervous system? Are you aware of the messages your body gives you? Because cortisol, the stress hormone that gets released when we feel that there's a danger, the impact of the overload of cortisol on the body is just so bad. More and more we hear of things like adrenal fatigue, the burnout, and that's not a cognitive thing. And the healing of trauma and the dealing of trauma has got nothing to do with your rational brain. It is, how do I understand when my body gives me a message to say, I'm not feeling this okay today. I feel a bit icky, or I feel a bit on the edge. To go and sit down and pause and say, okay, what has been happening in my life in the past while? Where can I draw this from? What has been happening? And how do I pause and actually get my body back to a state of, I can just breathe. We are not the survivor. Normally they say you are the survival of the fittest, which means that the more trauma I have, the more I keep carrying on. We are the survival of the most nurtured. So the more I can become aware of what is my nervous system and my body communicating to me, and how do I, plus the people around me, care for that. Because our bodies and our brains are not made for the society as it is today. We are the most advanced technologically, but we are the least connected. And it's about slowing down. If you listen to your body and your nervous system, you need to slow down, because you need to take that pause and say, what is actually happening to me? If you go and you listen to people who's had a heart attack, had a sudden stroke, they would say to you that the biggest message was, I needed to slow down.
Yeah.
And we are in this rat race of, I need to accomplish this, I need to do this, I need to do this, I need to learn that. We have not been made to be in that rat race. We have been made to be aware and take in. And how do we help each other in a conversation? If you and I are in a conversation about me being tuned into your nervous system, because actually what's happening is, it's not Claudia and Lenina that meets. It's two nervous systems that's engaging.
Thank you so much for that, Claudia. That was really interesting. You know, I love that there's a practical way for us, a practical place for us to start, which is to just start thinking about or recognizing what our body is, what messages our body is sending to us. What's coming through again here, so let's say we've had all this trauma, there's been an absence of buffers as we've been growing up. We realize this now, and we want to move towards healing. So the first step is being aware of our body, what's happening in our body, when we feel off, possibly when there's a red, warning light going on, like what is that message? I want to come back to the buffering system, like a support system. This keeps coming up as very important, even within healing. Let's say we don't have a supportive family, or we don't have that, or we see ourselves as not having that much support. If we want to move towards healing, how important is it for us to create a buffering system now in our lives? Do we still need buffering?
Yeah.
We're adults now.
Yeah. Okay, so if you've never experienced co-regulation, the buffering, you can't start regulating yourself. You need to experience the co-regulation.
Okay.
However, as a therapist, I've realized I often see adults that's not have got any adults in their lives, other adults in their lives that they feel physically safe with. And that's the first thing in your nervous system. You need to understand, what does it feel to feel safe?
Yeah.
So I can't say to that person, oh, well, go and join a group, find someone that you feel safe with. What I normally do is I ask the person, is there anyone that knows that you've come for therapy, that you feel comfortable enough to share this with? Because the problem is, I see the person for an hour once a week. The processing and what comes up in the body starts when you're not with me. So even in therapy, it's a slow process. I can't take you deeper than what your nervous system is capable of dealing with, because what I'm now showing you is how to start unraveling that feelings of discomfort and sit with it. And unless you feel safe enough with me and someone out there, I can't start the process. So sometimes it takes literally weeks, months before a person says, I've actually got one friend that I will share this with, or another person. In the meantime, it's about asking them, are there any activities that you do that make you feel, okay, now my body feels a bit more relaxed. And maybe even a support group, but how do you know that you can trust the people? Because that sense within your body that I feel okay takes time to develop. Because it's time for us to make relationships a safe place again. And this is where the whole link between trauma and addiction comes in. Addiction is any behavior that provides temporary relief from discomfort, despite the long-term consequences. And if you listen to that definition from Gabor Mate, then all of us are addicts. Because if you haven't had the buffer as a child, and your body keeps on feeling that discomfort, and relationships were not a safe place for you, you venture outside, either to pills or coffee or overwork or sport or the internet or shopping that gives you that reward. Now the brain has got an automatic reward system, but that reward system needs to be fed by relationships. And with most people nowadays, it doesn't. So what are the other, we call it the adaptations in your life that keep you in self-protection mode, but actually keeps you away from connecting with others. So the therapeutic relationship then becomes very important in how do I help that person to reconnect, first of all, with themselves, with their awareness of themselves and their body. And in that, how do I help them to develop what we call attunement to themselves and attunement to others? Because if I'm a child who grows up in an adult and no one was attuned to me, I can come across very selfish, and I can come across as a narcissist. Because no one was attuned to me. So if no one was attuned to me, how can I be expected to be attuned to others? I will be in total self-protection mode because I see everyone as a potential threat.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. I want to ask you, you were saying earlier, I just want to bring two of these things together. You were saying much earlier it's important to slow down. You've said in this answer that, we are all addicted in some way. And I'm gonna group that together to also addicted to busyness, right? So we're always moving. It's interesting that we think, we've replaced relationships with certain non-human buffers, whether it's Netflix or it's interesting that we are replacing it with things to do with busyness. And so it's keeping us away from building relationships, but also away from connecting with ourselves, which you said, first step is attunement. But let's look at that. The fact is that sitting with ourselves is just, it's not on our radar right now because life is so busy and we've been sold all these things to do. I was thinking this morning even about people who's like checking their WhatsApp while they're at a traffic light. Yeah. It's like, can we not even wait at the traffic light anymore without distracting our brain with something? But the other side of that is sitting with ourselves, sitting with our bodies, listening to our nervous system. Initially, that's going to be also very uncomfortable and feel very threatening, right? Yes. We're going to sit. Yes. I know if I try to write something really difficult out, my heart does start, just the act of writing it down, my heart starts pounding because I want to go and, binge on Modern Family, which makes me laugh and makes me feel better. So I just want to, I think, ask you about the discomfort we feel when we start this journey. I think to normalize the discomfort of that, to our bodies are seeing it as a threat. It's not a threat. How do we sort of calm ourselves down enough to be able to hold space?
So if I come from a family where there's discomfort, say parents have got words, I'm not even talking about violent conflict. There's a disagreement. But the child witnessed that the parents come and they can talk where the voices come down again. That child grows up in an environment where their nervous system's ability and window of tolerating discomfort is big. That's what we call a window of tolerance. Children that grow up in an environment where there's adversity without the restoring, window of tolerance is this small. So my focus in therapy is to help you to slowly increase your ability in your window of tolerance to sit with discomfort. Because the reality is, pain is never going to leave us. Physical, emotional pain is never going to leave us. Gabor Mate says in his new book, we've got this idealistic view of healing that, oh no, now all pain is gone. No, it's about how do we develop the capacity to tolerate pain? Because in relationships, you are bound to get hurt. We've got this warped idea that, no, now I'm sort of sealed. I've got Vaseline all over me. I'm not going to get hurt again. It is your ability then. How do I help you slowly? Bruce Perry talks about dose response, which means that I, as a therapist, needs to be tuned into your nervous system and see when the discomfort sets in. See when you start fidgeting. See when you start looking at the door. Then I need to know you now want to escape. Then I need to stop the process. As I help you with that, you become aware when intolerance set in and you can tell me we need to stop today. I can't handle more than this. Because if I go deeper and you can't pull yourself out of the discomfort, you're not going to want to come back. So when I show you, I honor your discomfort and I stop. That's what safety means. I help you to find that safety spot in your body so that we don't go further than that. But then every week or every second week, we push it a little bit further. But if you come the week and you say, I can't do any of that today, then we don't go there. But it's how do we then help people to widen that window? So that when I come now this time to you on a show, I understand I am going to sweat, but it's okay. I'm not in danger here.
Yes.
My father is not sitting there at the door and say, oh, how pathetic are you today?
It's like learning to swim, right? You go little bit at a time, little bit deeper, and stop, and then
there's a second facet to this. There's a term that they call about dual awareness. It means that there's an internal awareness and an external awareness. So it's normally our internal awareness that is the one that speaks from the past.
Okay.
And so when I become aware in my body of, I feel now out of sorts, I feel now there's something here, my body is saying I now need to go in fight or flight. I need to ask myself, is this an internal sensation, awareness that comes from a past? Or is it an external awareness? Is Lenina really a threat to me? And once people can start distinguishing between that, they can stop reacting from the past. Because trauma is the past that wants to hijack our present and future.
And so, I mean, I think that's great. And you know what's just striking me now also is that, you know, when I started reading about a lot of the stuff in the beginning also, you know, it's easy for you to sort of be dismissive of these types of abstract things. But I also just want to say, really, it doesn't matter who you are, it doesn't matter how much, perceived success that you have. And I know a lot of psychologists I've spoken to have said that they are counseling really, really, really people who are in like really, heads of companies, heads of big companies, who still are reacting from that past. So we try to fill the hole sometimes with success, or we try to fill the holes with, I said in another show, material things. And yet, I think I'm trying to make the point that those things don't go away.
No, there was a phrase that I read yesterday that says, how different the world will be if we measure success by how safe people feel in our presence.
Oh yes, I saw that one as well. I mean, and so also loving that we're speaking about psychological safety, emotional safety, and what that means and looks like for us. We need to take a short break, Claudia and audience, but we will be back with more after this. Welcome back. You're still watching Mental Health Matters. We have been having a fascinating conversation around trauma, emotional regulation, and the nervous system with Claudia Roodt, who is a clinical social worker and a trauma-informed therapist. And Claudia, we've covered so much ground here today. We have looked at sort of how trauma begins, the need for a buffer so that adversity doesn't become trauma. And in the last you know, before the break, we were talking about how important relationships are in terms of a buffer. And I specifically remember you said we live in a very technologically advanced world, but in the least connected world, and how that has affected all of us. We've got the last few minutes of the show. I wanted to sort of go into, you know, where do we start with our journey to healing, acknowledging that a lot of people do not have access to professionals like yourself or professional services to start really digging deep into the nervous system. How are there safe spaces that we can start, small things that we can do just for the viewers at home?
So something that's developed over the last couple of years is what they call the art of holding space. And that, together with what does it mean to be present. So an exercise I do with people when I train people in the community that want to know more about trauma is I send them out tutus together and I say the one person must share something personal with the other one. But the person that listens is not allowed to say anything, to respond, to give advice, to give an opinion. You're only allowed to be present. And every time the result is exactly the same. We are a society at the moment that don't know how to be present with one another. We feel that if I can't give you an answer, I don't serve a purpose in your life. If I can't give you an opinion, if I can't fix what you bring to me, I don't serve a purpose. And actually what people need, what our children need, is for you to just be fully present. Because as I'm fully present, there's a theory developed called the self-healing community. If I'm fully present with you, I allow you to access the healer within you. Because as you hear me, as I hear myself talk to you, I get to my own answers. Because that thing of trying to walk in someone else's shoes, I can never walk in someone else's shoes. Doesn't matter how empathetic I am. Because your nervous system experience, I cannot experience that. But if I'm present and you feel that you can completely be yourself, I don't come and I impose on you. So it's about being present. The second thing is, I help people, I say, if I want to hold space for you, I am the sort of hypothetical container for your story. But I need to know that my container doesn't have my own story in. So I ask people, I say, bring a little bucket or a container with 4 stones and look at your own story. And what if your own story is going to be so in your face with this person's that all you want to do is you want to share, we always want to be one up. No, you know what happened to me.
Yes, and I want you to say often the most toxic, I think I'm always fascinated in society. We're living in a comparison-driven society. So not just materialism and things, but also experiences and exactly
and
the
in
way
fact,
you
when
explained
I
it.
say that to you, I hijack your story.
Yeah.
And immediately you think, well, so my story is not center anymore. So it's important that even if in your community, in your family, with your children, with your aunt, with your parents, when you hold space for them, it's about their story and their experience, not about whether you've gone through the same thing. So it's slowing down so that when you're a Friday evening sitting in the family room, when you're sitting with your spouse, start with 5 minutes being present with one another, where you don't have to say anything, because that presence makes you comfortable in the discomfort with one another. If I'm comfortable with the discomfort, we stay connected. If I'm uncomfortable with the discomfort and I need to keep myself busy, we disconnect.
I saw a meme the other day that actually, so it was a cartoon, and someone asked someone else, how are you? And the other one said, oh, you know, I'm not doing so well, I'm feeling this way and this way. And the person responded, would you like advice or support? And so I think it's really important. I think one of the other ways I've seen it phrased is also deep listening. But I think the overall message that you are giving, which I think is very important, is that don't offer judgment, don't even offer advice.
No. And
Being a
listen,
holding space is just listening.
and listen to what is not being said.
Yeah.
Look at the person's body language. And one thing my youngest daughter has taught me is ask the person, what is it that you want me to do? Is it to listen? Is it to journey with you? Is it to hold space for you? Because people don't want us to tell them how to live their lives.
Yeah, and also that is often what generates a second nervous system response, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's about how do we get back to basics of just being present with one another.
Would you suggest also people take time to just sit with themselves?
Yeah, yeah. Get to know, because behavior always has a message, and underneath that message is a need that's not met. And that's also the one thing that I want to say in closing is that people think trauma is, oh, I've been abused, I've been kidnapped, I've lost my parents. Often trauma starts with needs that's not been met because the parents were not attuned to that specific child's nervous system needs. So now that child is emotionally neglected. That's often when I hear people coming to me and say, no one has understood me my whole life. You need to be attuned to really get to know in the context of this person, in the context of their relational environment. I always say to people, draw for me, tell me about the relational environment in which you grew up. Has anyone ever listened to you? 9 out of 10 times, it's no one.
So I think that's wonderful, and I think that, to start with listening is such a practical space, and to start with listening, I think, with ourselves, and maybe also when you start thinking about your own things and journaling your own things, and see if you can approach yourself with no judgment. And as such, you start practicing how to approach sort of the broader environment and build relationships without judgment. Claudia, we are out of time. I want to say thank you so much for coming on to the show and for sharing with us.
It's a big pleasure.
And that brings us to the end of Mental Health Matters for today. I'm Lenina Rassool. Thank you for joining us. Goodbye.